So thank you everyone for sticking with us throughout the day. I think what this day has demonstrated is that our struggles against capitalism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and sexism, and every structural systems of oppression are interlinked, and that many of us are experiencing them simultaneously, and that these power dynamics actually significantly impact all of us at varying degrees. Solidarity is an anti-capitalist political party and movement, and in 2016 we committed ourselves through our resolution on including feminism to struggle against all forms of oppression and discrimination, and to radically change social relations and power dynamics, emphasizing collective action led by the primarily concerned people. So our plenary is on intersectionality and inclusive feminism, the need to consider the dimensions of gender, class, race, sexualities in all their dimensions, and how they interact with each other to further marginalize certain groups of people. All of these forms of oppressions interact with each other in a context of imperialism and capitalism, and we need to understand them to better fight them and dismantle them. And yeah, social reproduction, sorry. Intersectionality has become a buzzword throughout today, and since we've tried to organize this event today, we have grappled with the concept, and is it still useful, and where it came from, and is it political praxis, is it a legal theory? And what we've been talking about is that it has been void of its political meaning, and now can easily be assimilated to identity politics, oppression Olympics, and that the focus is not anymore on, doesn't seem to be at least, on questioning structural systems of discrimination and oppression, but rather on policing in the individuals and on focusing on the individual rather than questioning material conditions and questioning the structures and the power dynamics that shape our lives. So the question that I would pose to our panelists is that in a situation where neoliberalism and white supremacy and patriarchy seem to have voided intersectionality of its political meaning, do we still need intersectionality? Is it still a valid tool in our toolbox to organize and to focus on collective mass mobilization and collective action against these power dynamics and against the system as it is currently? Or do we need something else, or does it even matter? And I will start by giving the floor to Tithi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, comrade. I want to start by thanking the comrades in Solidarity for inviting me here. I have had a great opportunity to learn from your struggles. I want to extend a particular thank you to the comrades who've been translating all day, and they've been doing it on a regular basis, so thank you, comrades. This is a difficult task to try and have comments and a solution to the theoretical behemoth that intersectionality has become at the moment. So I'm going to approach it from a slightly different perspective, and bear with me, it will all cohere in some way. So I want to start by the question of the collective and the question of unity. So if we look around us today, the international women's strike movement, the feminist strike movement, is a very important international movement. It's one of the first, actually, in the period of neoliberalism. The climate strike movement is soon developing as one more, but the feminist strike movement was one of the first international movement of solidarity and collective action across borders. So if it is international on this scale, the expression then the collective experience must have been international and collective as well. So if the struggle against gender oppression, against capitalism, was expressed in such a collective manner across international borders, then one assumption can be that the experience of these oppressions was also collective or also similar. And this is where I think there is an important rider and lesson to be learned here from ideas of intersectionality, that even if the expression is often collective, the experience of the oppression is not always collective. So let's start from that. This is a lesson that we know well in left organizing in the United States. The question of Palestine is considered a third rail in political organizing. Third rail is that one rail in the metro system. If you touch it, you'll die. So touching Palestine was considered for the longest time in the United States political organizing as the third rail. So unity was achieved in the anti-war movement by suppressing the question of Palestine, okay? So bringing up Palestine was considered divisive, so unity or collective was achieved by suppressing it. Similarly, in recent times, I've been going up and down the country talking to striking teachers. As you might know, there's a teachers' strike wave right now in the United States. I was in Kentucky, in a city called Louisville. In Louisville, Kentucky, there was a bill that was proposed in their state legislature the same time as the bill attacking the teachers' strike. So there was one bill attacking the teachers' pensions, but the other bill was called the gang bill, which was essentially a bill to criminalize association of groups of more than 3 people in particular neighborhoods because crime was so high. This was clearly a racist bill targeted towards communities of color. When teachers and activists of color raised the question that since we are building for a strike, we should do the two things together. We should use our collective power to question both the attack on our pensions and the crime bill, the so-called crime bill. But union bureaucrats said that actually is a divisive action because it only applies to communities of color. It's not a universal action, so we should go ahead with our collective, what we have in common, rather than what divides us. So this question of the collective as an expression of unity is a problematic question that we must address. Is it really an expression of unity, or is it a suppression of particular forms of oppression? So those two examples I give you to understand the framework of a collective or the framework of a unity, which is not always simple or straightforward. The common understanding in older Marxist and feminist organizing has been that unity as a political practice is achieved on the basis of class, whereas oppressions are what divides the working class. So this is the common sense understanding that we are united on the basis of class, divided on the basis of oppression. This, I think, needs to be challenged robustly by us, simply because workers are very divided on the basis of class. Look at the labor market. Right? So the labor market wages are something that absolutely divide workers. So the idea that they're united on the basis of class is just simply not true. And also, organizing on the basis of social oppression is often a position of unity and strength rather than a position of division. So for this, I think we need to understand that the worker arrives, a comrade here talked about social reproduction, that we understand that the worker arrives at the doorway of the workplace fully produced or reproduced in particular ways. But we have to understand that different sections of the working class are differentially reproduced because of differential access to particular means of social reproduction. So for instance, in particular neighborhoods, schools are funded less than schools in other neighborhoods. So rich neighborhoods, rich white neighborhoods in various countries of the global north have better schooling systems, education systems than in neighborhoods where people of color live or migrant communities live. So schools, hospitals, these various institutions of social reproduction are actually differentially funded by capitalism in order to produce a differentially socially reproduced working class. So in other words, the question of oppression is not simply at the level of wages or can be fought at the level of the labor market, must be fought much deeper into a structural analysis of capitalism as a whole as to how this differential access in turn shapes a working class that must struggle to overcome the tensions and inequalities that these oppressions produce. And this is where I think intersectionality theory has made a very important contribution to our understanding of social oppression. But before I go to intersectionality, I think I want to distinguish, and again, I'm coming from the US context, which tries to hegemonize discussions. And so we must be careful that we don't use the US context to understand global phenomena. So I want to be very clear that this is a specific US understanding rather than how intersectionality perhaps works out in your particular organizational context. So in the US, intersectionality as a theory, perhaps you know, comes from Kimberly Crenshaw's very famous essay on intersectional oppressions. And that has a very specific valence to deal with the bourgeois law. So the understanding of oppression is based on a bourgeois juridical notion of oppression. And so it has its own problems, but it also is very specifically targeted towards understanding a specific framework, that of bourgeois juridical practices. So that's the first. The second, however, from that, intersectionality has spawned into the buzzword that Comrade talked about before, including Hillary Clinton using intersectionality in her election campaign in 2016. But that said, intersectionality as it's used and mobilized as an idea in movement spaces has a very different connotation in the US. So if in your campus or in your movement space, someone says, I am an intersectional feminist, then as a Marxist, you must seek her out and work with her, because it usually means she's an anti-racist feminist. That's what the word has come to denote or connote, despite what the theory's shortcomings might be. So that kind of double understanding of intersectionality is very important for us in the US to bear in mind when we discuss the theory, that there is a movement language and a movement understanding of this term, whereas there is an academic understanding and exposition of this term. So both of that have to be kept in mind. So here I think I want to talk about the theory of it rather than the movement aspect of it, because we want to use theories in our movement that expands the horizon and militancy of our movement rather than contains it. So we want to be theoretically robust in how we cast our movements of the future. So the first thing is that this intersectionality as a theoretical analysis is very promising from previous understandings of struggle, because it talks about the multiplicity of struggles, right? So this is definitely, and it has rich descriptive power of what multiple struggles and intersections of struggle have. They are very, very rich descriptions of it. So the result of this sort of writing and thinking has been an emphasis in movement building. So for instance, Black Lives Matter sees itself as an intersectional movement that has recently teamed up, not recently as in yesterday, but for the last few years, have teamed up with the struggle for Palestine. So now there is actually a formation in the US called Black for Palestine. So this kind of movement building, often with an anti-capitalist focus, has been a result of this sort of understanding of intersectional movements. But difference of our understanding of intersections, that racism, sexism, colonialism, etc., are distinct struggles, can be the grounds for movements of solidarity, but not necessarily. They can also, this understanding can also be the ground for autonomous organizing. In other words, intersectionality as a theory does not give us the logic of the intersection. So while intersection is a wonderful descriptive tool to understand our world, it doesn't always give us why these intersections can be determinate, because it is seen as indeterminate. The intersections simply happen, but we are not given a theoretical understanding in the theory, the logic of the intersection. So before I talk about that a little bit, let me just say that often the understanding is that intersectionality is rooted in Black feminism. And it is, to a certain extent, true, but the story is not full. And we need to here, as Marxists and revolutionaries, really take pride in the fact that Black women actually led in Marxist organizations in the 30s and 40s. So that too is Black feminism to a certain extent. So Black feminism is not simply something that happened in the 50s and 60s and the 80s, right? So this is, so for instance, the CPUSA, you know, yes, Stalinist and everything, but in the 1920s actually had the Women's Bureau was set up in the manner of Russia in 1929, and their paper was called The Working Woman. And leading Black Marxist activists of the CP, of the Communist Party, wrote for the working women, and I encourage comrades to look up their writing. So for instance, Grace Lamb wrote extensively on the rents in Harlem, New York. Black domestic workers wrote in letters about their 14-hour working day. Louise Thompson Patterson, Esther Cooper, Jackson, and the more famous that is known now, Claudia Jones, were extensive writers of trying to theorize racism, sexism, and gender, but always within the framework of seeing themselves as communist activists, essentially revolutionaries. And so this is also a Black feminist tradition that has been obscured and silenced by this focus on neoliberal understanding of Black feminism. So this is a very insurgent Black feminism that we need to also talk about us, because these women talked about the triple exploitation of people as workers, as women, and as Negroes. That was the term they did. So I'm just qualifying what Black feminism, intersectionality has meant, because it's important, if you are questioning some of the theoretical assumptions, that you actually ground yourself in the specificity of what you're questioning. So my question about intersectionality theory is that it doesn't adequately theorize the logic of intersection. And this is why the question of political solidarity is often left indeterminate, a product of historical circumstances rather than historical necessity. That there is a necessity to unite against struggles rather than simply a choice or a moral imperative. Okay, so that's the logic of the theory does not explain that fully. So for instance, one theorist, Rita Kaur-Damoon, has said that one struggle for clean water in Detroit is inflected through race and racism, right? The struggle for clean water is seen as an anti-racist struggle. But the struggle for clean water in sections of Venezuela is actually organized through colonial oppression. So the question is, how do gender, caste, race uphold a shared set of social relations that express itself differentially across the globe and can be reliably reproduced by the system? So this is, so one way for us to understand it as social reproduction theorists is that the determinant terrain on which these struggles play out is that of capitalism. And this continual drive of capitalism for accumulation, for the production of profit over the production of people and their capacities makes the logic of these intersections actually determinant, because this terrain is shaped by sexist, racist, and colonialist relations. So the Detroit water struggle and the anti-Brahminical or caste struggles in India are different in form and historical memory, but have the same anti-systemic content in challenging capital's priorities of profit-making over people-making. So how do we build these solidarities is really the question for our times. And here I think the insights from social reproduction theory and the insights from revolutionary Marxism is actually very useful to be resuscitated, because these ideas existed before. We're not reinventing the wheel. What we do need to do is recapture those ideas from a more insurgent past and apply them to our current context. And here, I think struggles for care should be seen as in a much more politicized way. Care, I submit, and care work should not be seen in its individual manifestation alone, where someone, often a woman, provides care for an ailing body, a needy child, or a hungry family. In calling care a political act under neoliberalism, I want to refer to all acts and professions whose project it is to reduce the injuries of class. Thus, public schools that aim to better the life chances of working class children, public parks which can be restorative for their families and loved ones, public hospitals where working class lives can be repaired and rebuilt, are all instances of care in this political sense. All these services and infrastructures are those that are vital to the production of people, not just for reproducing their lives, but also for building capacities and attributes that are essential to the human condition. Locating care as one of the most political responses to austerity helps us understand better the connecting tissue between the various women-led movements of recent years, from the Argentine mass strikes against gender violence, the immense movement against water privatization in Ireland, to the current wave of teacher strikes from Tunisia to the United States. We can finally see these actions as driven by the same force, the need to establish a new common good. This new wave of struggle has also managed to blur the dangerous border between class struggle and feminist struggle fostered by many generations of the left. Consider the point of political convergence between the worldwide walkouts of Google employees against sexual harassment and the international women's strike movement that began on March 8, 2017 and show no signs of abating. While the Google walkouts were cited in workplaces, the March 8 movement has been on the streets. Both movements are predicated upon an explicitly feminist agenda. Most importantly, these braided strands of struggle have altered the boundaries of what counts as a feminist issue. Traditionally, feminist concerns have often been limited to issues such as abortion rights and sexual harassment or violence. This new class struggle feminism, however, has moved the compass from effects to causes of gender discrimination. The new movement is as intransigent against gender violence as it is against immigration laws that enforce precarity on migrant women and expose them to preying managers and bosses. Similarly, this new generation of feminists refuse to accept equal pay with men when both wages are low. Rather, the movement has enlarged the purview of feminism to address universal issues of wages, healthcare, and police violence. We are only now witnessing the beginnings of what might become a global revolt against austerity. But our movements must be politicized beyond their trade union expression. The class as a whole, our wages and pensions, as well as our homes and playgrounds, must be defended against the ravages of capitalism. For this to happen, there needs to develop and spread what Rosa Luxemburg once called a class feeling, which allowed Russian workers in 1905 to see every partial question of any small group of workers as a general question, as a class affair, which in turn provoked them to react to its influence as a unity. This is the achieved unity through struggle rather than assumed unity on the basis of false universals. This class feeling is yet to be. As a left, we sense it's coming, but as revolutionaries, we must ensure its success. Thank you.
And well, thanks, Tithi, for this wonderful intervention. I agree with everything, and I think I'm going to repeat also some of the things that Tithi just said wonderfully. Actually, I'm Italian, but I live in the UK, in London, a country that, well, in the last few years, you don't see much in the news because of the vibrancy of its feminist movement, unfortunately, but more because of Brexit. So I'm sorry if the situation is not exactly very cheering. But actually, what I want to do today is really to reflect, to try to understand what we're asking, which is how to build an intersectional and inclusive feminist movement, also by reflecting on the situation in the UK, which I think is actually illuminating in spite of its not very energizing situation in the feminist movement at the very moment. And I want to reflect a little bit with you precisely about why the UK at the moment is not registering much feminist mobilizations, or what it seems like is not registering much feminist mobilizations, though I want to challenge a little bit also this idea. So last year on March 8th, there was a big demo actually, and there was an attempt at bringing together feminists from different groups and different traditions and different feminist struggles. This year, March 8th, was much smaller in comparison, and it was mostly organized around the demand of sex workers for the decriminalization of sex work. So it was a smaller demonstration, mostly involving sex workers, but also there were actions by trans women against, there is a long discussion now going on in the UK about gender identity and trans women, and in particular there has been action against the imprisonment of trans women in male prisons, which is something it's increasingly going on. So these were the main two actions and struggles that were present, I would say, on March 8th. There were a certain fatigue instead to bring together the bigger demonstration of last year and to bringing together different struggles. So though there are feminist collectives and there has been an intense debate in the UK, it appears to be hard, increasingly to be hard, to mobilize on March 8th, and but more generally, I would say, to put the strike of social reproduction on the agenda in like it's happening actually in other countries. Now, I think there are many reasons for this kind of fatigue that we see. I guess one of the reasons is the sectoralization of the trade unions movement, unlike maybe in other countries, particularly I'm thinking of continental Europe. There is a certain fragmentation of different feminist collectives, but I think perhaps it's also been, I'm even tempted to say, the lack of a unifying moment like it's been in other countries, like the attack on reproductive rights. We don't really see this happening in the UK. I mean, the right wing, the Tory right wing, so far has not really attacked the right to abortion, for instance, like it's happening in other countries, what the right wing is doing in other countries. So in that sense, I'm not saying that the situation is perfect when it comes to the right of abortion, but this was not so much in the right wing agenda so far. So in that sense, there has been a certain lack of what in other countries was, in a way, a catalyst, a unifying moment. And yet, in spite of this scenario that I know I'm not depicting a very vibrant and exciting scenario, but in spite of this, I think it's important to actually mention and valorize that there have been numerous important mobilizations and strikes involving mostly women. So all across London's universities, for example, in the last 5 years, cleaners who are mostly migrant and racialized women have been on strike to ask to be brought in-house by universities and to improve their working conditions. So maybe to explain for those of you who are not familiar with these kind of with these words. So basically what happens in many universities in London and in many working places really is that cleaners usually are not part of the staff. They are not employed by the universities. They are employed by cooperatives or companies that work for the universities, but they have different working conditions. They have their own contracts. And this has meant for these cleaners that they don't have rights like, for example, holidays, paid social care. They don't have permanent contracts in many ways. So they are not subject to the same better working conditions like the university staff. So these strikes actually demanded that cleaners become employers of the universities, exactly like other employers. And in at least 2 cases, they were actually successful. So at the LSE and at Goldsmiths, which is the college in which I work, now cleaners are employees. So it's been a very important success for these strikes. I also want to mention another strike, which is the strike that took place in October 2018, last year, in Glasgow, where thousands of female council workers went on strike for 2 days to demand pay equality. It's been a long controversy in Glasgow due to an old law from 2006, actually a law that was passed by the Labour Council that actually wanted to bring more pay equality, but it resulted in terrible gender pay gap. So it's been a controversy going on for years, and finally these workers went on strike. And the majority, again, of these council workers are women who work in schools, work as cleaners, work as teachers, as carers. They do all kinds of jobs within the council. Now, these strikes obviously have their own specificity, and they had their own demands, and they were conducted separately, and they were not really, was not, as far as I know, any attempt at bringing them together. But they have not really been framed as feminist strikes, even though they involved mostly women, and even though, especially in the case of Glasgow, the strike was specifically and explicitly for pay equality, for having for gender equality against the gender pay gap. Now, I want to argue, however, that these strikes and these struggles need to be seen as feminist struggles and feminist strikes through and through, and they are intersectional feminist struggles and strikes, not only because they have involved mostly working class women, but also migrant and racialized women, who are the majority of the workers of these sectors. The fact, however, that they were not framed as such, as feminist strikes, with the exception of Tithi, actually, who argued that these should be regarded as, rightly so, as feminist strikes. But the difficulty of doing that in the UK, I think it's to bring these struggles together, I think is telling, because it speaks to us about a certain gap, I think, between theory and practice, on which I think we need to reflect very closely. So the UK, and I say this because the UK has a very long tradition of reflections on intersectionality. And perhaps I would even say that is one of the countries in Europe in which these discussions happened earlier. We have already discussions on intersectionality throughout the 1970s, certainly in the 1980s. Lots of books and articles have been written about intersectionality as a theory. And in this sense, I would say it's a kind of given in many feminist circles that, of course, feminist and feminism should be intersectional. So in a way, my feeling sometimes is that this is much more taken for granted, in theory at least, in the UK than in other countries in which these discussions are more recent. And yet, in spite of the fact that in the UK this is kind of course, feminism should be intersectional, at the same time, it is the feminist movement and all these discussions have been incredibly fragmented. And it seems to me that there is a recognition. Oh, only 2 minutes. Okay, so there is a recognition of the importance of doing this, of building an intersectional movement. But in practice, we don't quite know how to do it. We don't quite know how to bring together those strikes I was talking about. So these difficulties are often you know, rooted in disagreements between different groups that are inherited, I would say, rather than fully endorsed or even understood by the younger generations. And I'm not obviously here to solve this riddle. I mean, obviously, is the question here, how do we build truly intersectional struggles, which obviously we recognize it's really hard. But what I want to do, I want to speak about these two symptomatic strikes in the universities by cleaners and by council workers, because I think these struggles tell us two things very quickly. I think the first is that we need to fight, and I'm being very social democratic here now because I'm talking about concrete demands, so bear with me 1 second. I think that they tell us that we need to fight for public and universal care as key to enable a truly feminist and intersectional movement, because to have public and universal care would mean not only more equality among women who use these services, because as you know, now there is a huge difference between poorer women who cannot afford many of these services or can only afford very poor quality services because they are all privatized. But this also means, in particular, I would say, more equality for racialized and migrant women who are a majority of the workers in these sectors. And as we know, it's the reason why obviously the university and cleaners wanted to be brought in-house is because they had better working conditions in that way. But this is my second point, which is less social democratic, is that I would say that fighting for public services, for public and universal services, is certainly not enough, as the Glasgow workers obviously teach us, because in that case, they are council workers, they are workers in the public sector, but at the same time, as they teach us, they have very bad working conditions. Why? Because they are socially reproductive workers, they are care workers who work in a system in which care work is undervalued, is stigmatized, is considered unskilled, dirty, is feminized and racialized. So to conclude, I want to say that this is really the true riddle. So I think at the end of the day, it's important to recognize that only because care is not compatible with capitalism, even when we try to as I said, make it public and turn it into a good through state provisions and universal provision, we are still faced with a fundamental undervaluation and stigmatization of this work, which is necessary to capitalism. Because I fundamentally think, as Tithi teaches us all too well, that truly care work and care in the sense of, I really love the expression you used, as that work and activity that tries to repair the injuries of class. I really love that. I think this is simply not compatible with capitalism, because capitalism is obviously geared towards profit making and not people making or well-being making in the true sense of the word. So to conclude, I want to say that to build a truly intersectional feminist movement, it goes hand in hand with building an anti-capitalist feminist movement.
Okay, so hello again, everyone. It's quite a task, actually, making an intervention after such great previous speakers. So I guess what I thought I could do, perhaps, is talk a little bit about how intersectionality has looked in practice. And let me start off by saying that when I was asked to talk about intersectionality, I had this deep ambivalence around it. And I think it's precisely because there is a part of me that is questioning how it's being used and the ways in which it has almost become a new language for diversity. I don't know, it feels like that, huh? So I'm sort of, and of course I have no sense yet of how it's being deployed here. So what I can speak on a bit is how intersectionality has looked in South Africa, and sort of trace a little bit about how that's come about. So, I mean, I would agree that long before the language of intersectionality came about, in South Africa there was a very clear sense of how race and class were converging onto bodies. And, you know, I'm going to like do a little sort of bit around looking at queerness in this instance. So, you know, in the 90s in South Africa, Simon Nkosi, who was an anti-apartheid activist, who had also been part of the Communist Party in South Africa, in its banned state and so on, and had in fact been imprisoned along with Mandela. He had said, when he was outed as a gay man, and you know that he was being faced with being expelled from a number of movements, he also, and then also this sort of desire from many directions to get him to choose a singular identity, he made this very famous intervention where he said, I am black and I'm gay and I cannot separate myself into primary and secondary identities. And he, you know, one of the things that he did in fact in 1990 was he, together with a number of other black queer feminists, organized the first Johannesburg Pride. Now, I think we live in a time, and I'll talk a bit about this in a sec, we live in a time where pride has become like the sort of ultimate expression of neoliberalism, I think. But I think important to note that in the 90s, at that time, it was actually a revolutionary act. And it was revolutionary because, in fact, many white gays at that time had distanced themselves from people like Simon and others, and in fact had taken the side of the apartheid government. And so this expression then of gayness in the streets of Johannesburg as an anti-apartheid, as a class struggle, was quite significant. But of course what we saw over the years was a discrediting of this kind of approach. We saw the rise of this sort of liberal, neoliberal approach to gay rights, and so on. And so really already by sort of maybe 15 years into Pride being organized, it had very quickly become a gay marketing tool, right? So it had become privatized, corporatized, and so on. And so it was also at this time that a group decided to disrupt that. So maybe just to give a little bit of background around this group, which I was part of, was called the 1 in 9 campaign, and we started that at the time of the rape of Fezeka Kuzwayo by Jacob Zuma, who was a deputy president of the African National Congress and who was also later to become the president of the country. And starting on the grounds of looking at violence, it became quite clear that there was a need to disrupt this idea of what counted as violence. So this group, in addition to working, of course, around rape and sexual violence, was also talking about how dispossession of land was also violence and needed to be addressed and countered. And so the sort of action had started with, and I guess 1 in 9, one of its sort of primary action means of disruption and advocacy was the use of direct action and disruption. And so we had noticed also not only how Pride and so on had become corporatized and in fact co-opted, but we were also looking at things like National Women's Day, which had of course been a huge site of struggle against apartheid, where you had thousands of women, black women, rejecting the kind of system of registration and curtailment of movement and so on. And how this had become, again, a thing of like giving flowers, or I think in the first panel people had spoken about this, launching, you know, sort of platforms and mechanisms and all of this sort of thing, and had effectively been hijacked in its meaning. And so this group of activists in the 1 in 9 campaign disrupted this, physically putting their bodies in the way of a sort of a celebratory moment. And from that point on, decided that actually it wasn't enough just to disrupt the ANC and the women's sort of, this very statist expression of feminism, but that we also needed to go to other articulations of the same thing, which led us then to disrupt pride. Now, I thought it was a time warning, but it's just a nice dress. But, now where was I? That's what happens when you look at nice dresses. But what was really interesting was the ways in which, in this disruption of pride, which literally was physically there were about 30 of us, putting our bodies down in the procession of pride of about 35,000 people, how in that moment we were also stripped of our sexuality in that moment. So people were saying things like we can't be gay, that we need to go back to the township, which are the sort of enclosed, apartheid-style places for black people to live, and so on. So we were stripped of sexuality. We could not be gay, and so on. So I think that this is one moment of rupture. In terms of, and how clearly it demonstrates also a kind of intersectional organizing. Because in that process, it was also about talking not only about the corporatizing of pride and so on, but also talking about how it connected to other things that were happening at the same time. For instance, the Marikana massacre. So all those things were connected. The last example that I want to give is just around the student movement in South Africa. Now, despite the Freedom Charter, which establishes the right to free education, which was a sort of cornerstone, one of the cornerstones of our democracy, of course that hasn't transpired. And so what started in the students, in many of the universities, in South Africa as a call for free education and debt cancellation because of the extraordinarily expensive system of people getting loans and the impossibility of ever paying those loans back to be able to get an education. It moved to the call for decolonizing education and decolonizing the educational institutions in South Africa. And then also started taking into account the casualization of labor on university campuses. So I think, again, this is an example of how, and in this instance, a very explicit articulation and drawing on the language of intersectional politics and so on. So, so I guess those are just two examples. I mean, just to circle back to this, I really do worry about the ways in which it becomes shorthand. And in that shorthand, so we can say that instead of saying the longer story, because it's easier and quicker and we all know what that means, that how that erases the ways in which race operates and the ways in which class operates. And so I'm interested to hear how that's happening here. And the discussion.
There is a part of me that just wants to say, okay, there is really nothing new I'm going to add. I would rather sit there and hear more after all the presentations. Just maybe very shortly, I will probably talk about how I understood the theory, and I really do agree with you that I think we do need to have a more robust understanding of theory and when I came into it and what it's meant for me. And I'm going to use some analysis from India. I mean, before I understood intersectionality or even read about it, what it meant, the concepts, what it meant, I think, for a lot of us from India actually came from understanding and learning more about the movements around caste, and particularly how that was that played out, and the operation and the oppressions around particularly the Dalit and the indigenous Dalit and the Adivasi communities in India. And this and this began with maybe over time reading about how education, caste-based occupation, and how the system, the organization of society was based around caste. It cut across religion. The colonialism appropriated it in a certain way to make it what it is, and the neoliberal Brahminical version of caste is continuously being used to organize the society, so to say. And as one learns more about it, and also understanding that for a long time there was very particularly, and there's a lot written around it on how Dalit women's issues were seen as something that needs to be taken, that will be put down on the list because it wouldn't unify everybody. Going from what it was saying, it wasn't the experience of all women. And the fact that it wasn't the experience of all women, and that the movement at one point did not see caste, like a lot of us who were born in the upper caste wouldn't see it, said a lot about where our movements are and how oppressions were seen, and the intersections of gender and caste is somehow, I think now we, in many ways when I come here, is how race and gender is always seen as one plus other or one comma other. Like, you know, it's seen as immutable, essential, non-moving concepts, and the way to talk about intersectionality is to add plus, 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 and to see oppression as this happens, plus this happens, plus this happens, and not as that they all work together in a particular fashion. And these experiences aren't immutable, they aren't essentialized, and they don't remain the same depending on your location. And I think location-wise, class plays a lot. And that's the experience we've seen on how location movement and who you are, all of that, which everybody sort of here knows. And I think for me, it's intersectionality and the understanding of oppressions actually really helped move beyond how a lot of the times we do it in legal theory of just putting, you know, 1 + 2 + 2 + 3 + 4, and it comes up, and as a way of making it more understandable and making it, reducing the complexity of what it is, and also then denying experiences, then denying, and also at some point being okay, or what does this difference mean to our organizing? And I think that differential experiences which might not bring a single unitary idea of a transnational women's movement, feminist movement, then what does that kind of mean? I think that is for me a question that constantly is something that I'm grappling, and it would be good to hear. And just because it's one of the things that I like to say, it's because of how at least I learned intersectionality theory also as coming from a legal theory on how some of the origins. To me, it also helped understanding, yes, Paola, I'm going to say law is a bourgeois concept.
Thank you.
But to also say that to remove the idea of, especially in law, courts, and jurisprudence, to remove the idea of objectivity and neutrality as the thing that we all need to look for. It needs to be objective, it needs to be neutral, which all political movements have said, if you are objective and you're neutral, you are taking a position. But we don't, and I think all of us, we don't bring that in when we talk about our laws, when we talk about legal reform. And I think understanding how oppressions and how how they intersect meant that there needs to be a push for that particular entire movement, which always seems to be somewhere above there with that idea of, I'm going to be very objective because, you know, application of law is neutral, application of law is neutral, and we're going to look at it neutrally and apply it neutrally, whereas that's not how life works. And I think intersectionality, in many ways, helped understand what that subjectivity and how oppression needs, and how that needs to come into how we understand law and how we understand jurisprudence. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So we're going to take questions. On va prendre des questions maintenant.
Yeah, it's not really a question, but it's just to say a few things from my own experience, because I think what came out from all the contributions is that instinctively women activists, feminist activists, have always understood that the intersectional nature of women's oppression, and therefore the movement has to be built. But I think that as been said, when we began to use the term intersectionality, it did indeed show a step forward in how we understood that, or at least what it tried to say was that when we used to use terms like double oppression and triple oppression, it did sound like you were just piling the ones on the other, and that you don't understand, for example, what is the oppression of a black woman by adding what you see as the racism against a black man to what you see of the woman's oppression of a white woman, sort of like putting them one on top of the other, and therefore you get that result. And so I think I agree that it was a very important introduction into helping us understand and describe. But then again, and I agreed with the way that Tithi put it, that it doesn't show the absolute necessity of fighting them together. As I say, I think that instinctively we have understood that. I mean, to go back to a very long time before most of you were born, in the early 1970s, the National Abortion Rights Campaign, or in Britain, we found out that women, Bangladeshi women in the East End of London, were being used as guinea pigs for the testing of Depo-Provera, without knowing it. Yeah. They were just and obviously, although we remained, because we were having one of those moments that brought everybody together, because we were fighting an attack on the abortion law at that point, but it was obvious to us that this was part of our struggle. And that we had to take it on, even if we didn't change the name at that point of the abortion rights campaign. Although at an international level, I remind you, the International Abortion Rights Campaign quickly became the International Campaign on ICAS, abortion, sterilization, and contraception, and then took up the questions of women's reproductive health and so on. So I do think that the women's movement responds, understands, and then afterwards it is a way of finding the ways that explain and make it obvious how we have to fight together, because I'm not wanting to say there are no problems. And just quickly for Sara, obviously one of the main problems for the British women's movement, like the whole of the British left, comes from that woman who figures in your daughter's book about women who've made a change, which is Margaret Thatcher. Because when she drove the miners to the national miners' strike, I mean, there was enormous solidarity. You've all seen the film Pride, and my criticism of that film is it doesn't show how the women in the mining communities and the feminist movement organized a solidarity, but it broke the trade union movement, the left, and the feminist movement in one fell swoop.
Bon, je voulais avoir un peu le temps de préparer mon intervention, mais voilà, ce ne sera pas le cas. Déjà, merci beaucoup. Vraiment, j'étais vraiment d'accord avec l'essentiel de ce qui a été dit, et je dois dire que ça fait vraiment plaisir, parce qu'en fait, c'est pas si souvent qu'on a ce genre d'intervention de camarades féministes, et à titre personnel, ça me redonne vraiment du courage donc, dans la lutte quotidienne, donc merci beaucoup. Et une des choses que je voulais dire, c'est que la façon dont s'articule race, classe et genre, en fait, elle n'a pas simplement des effets au niveau des luttes locales. Il faut aussi le voir à un niveau global dans la façon dont les mouvements ouvriers en général, les mouvements féministes en général et les mouvements anticoloniaux ou antiracistes se construisent. Et je pense que si on regarde aujourd'hui la période dans laquelle on est, en tout cas, je pense que c'est vrai dans en fait, la plupart des endroits où il y a les camarades qui sont à la tribune. En fait, on assiste à globalement une chute du mouvement ouvrier avec une décomposition des organisations, qu'elles soient politiques, syndicales et y compris féministes. Et en fait, la décomposition de là a des effets sur l'autre. Alors, effectivement, ça reste des mouvements autonomes, il y a des histoires particulières, mais une des choses, je pense, très importantes qui s'est passée depuis les années 70, ça a été l'intégration progressive de ces institutions à l'appareil d'État, avec des logiques un peu différentes en fonction des différents mouvements. Le mouvement ouvrier, ce qui a été catastrophique, ça a été le développement du dialogue social au niveau syndical. Voilà, on le voit aujourd'hui sur le comportement des directions syndicales en général qui négocient plutôt qui en appellent à une construction d'un rapport de force, etc. Mais c'est aussi vrai pour le mouvement féministe. En particulier en France, c'est très fort. Et un des effets que ça a eu en France, donc du coup, comme je suis française et que j'habite en France dans le contexte que je connais le mieux, c'est que ce mouvement féministe étant progressivement, alors pas comme les organisations syndicales, je pense de façon différente, intégré, ou on va dire à transformer sa relation qu'elle avait à l'État, et du coup sur les pratiques qu'elle avait, ça a eu l'effet que la façon dont le mouvement féministe radical s'est redéveloppé depuis les années 2000, ça s'est fait en dehors du mouvement ouvrier, et aussi de toute l'histoire du mouvement ouvrier, en particulier du marxisme. Et donc du coup avec un rejet très fort de toute l'histoire du marxisme et de l'apport des luttes marxistes en général, y compris des luttes marxistes féministes, et notamment Tithi, quand tu disais, en fait, il y a eu un black feminism aussi dans les années 20 et les années 30 par des nanas qui étaient communistes, ça c'est quelque chose qui est méconnu. Mais à une échelle plus petite, un des autres effets qu'a eu en fait l'intégration progressive et ces petits groupes radicaux qui se construisent dans leur coin, c'était une extrême fragmentation de ces groupes-là, et du coup une immense difficulté à avoir des luttes communes un peu d'ampleur. Donc ça c'est un des premiers problèmes, mais un des deuxièmes problèmes aussi, c'est l'absence de transmission de mémoire et de transmission théorique. Et en fait, je pense que c'est pas uniquement la façon dont l'intersectionnalité a été reçue qui font qu'on a des générations de militantes qui ont l'impression qu'elles sont les premières à être des féministes et antiracistes et lutte de classe et anticolonialistes, etc. C'est qu'aussi cette fragmentation de groupes qui naissent et qui meurent font qu'il n'y a pas de transmission de mémoire militante. Et ça, c'est un véritable problème qu'on a. Et notamment, quand on est une militante féministe qui commence à se former, on a cette espèce de fatigue de devoir toujours repartir du bas. Et c'est fatigant. Et d'ailleurs, moi, ça me fait plaisir que, vraiment, merci, que là, on peut directement aller aux questions qui nous... des choses qui nous préoccupent, quoi. Et je pense qu'un des enjeux essentiels dans la période, et pour ça, je pense que les camarades suisses, pour nous, en France, ça nous fait vraiment du bien, c'est de reconstruire des fronts uniques. Ça me semble essentiel dans la situation. Et aussi reconstruire des organisations féministes qui ont une ambition au-delà du local, qui ont vraiment l'ambition de se construire à une échelle nationale et internationale. Et du coup, de ce point de vue-là, la grève des femmes à l'échelle internationale, c'est vraiment hyper important. Et quand on parle souvent de quatrième vague, je sais pas, c'est central, y compris pour faire exister nos luttes locales. Et la dernière chose que je voulais dire, c'est que je pense un des effets néfastes de la façon dont l'intersectionnalité a été reçue comme un dogme suffisant à lui-même, parce que le problème de la façon dont c'est reçu, essentiellement, c'est que c'est vu comme quelque chose de suffisant en termes théoriques, c'est qu'en fait, les groupes qui naissent de ça sont des groupes qui s'autodétruisent parce que c'est des groupes qui sont tout petits et du coup qui vont ne pas chercher à s'étendre puisque la théorie individualise tout. Donc en fait, ça va être comment moi je m'en sors, ce qui est essentiel et important, mais il faut aller au-delà de ça, mais qui aussi du coup va chercher dans son propre groupe qui est le plus opprimé, qui est le plus oppressif. Et je pense que quiconque a vécu ces expériences-là sait que ce sont des groupes qui naissent et qui meurent en général dans une violence personnelle hyper forte et qui dégoûtent des générations de militantes. Donc ça n'a pas seulement un effet d'être insuffisant théoriquement et un peu sans perspective, c'est que je pense que ça fait énormément de mal et ces nouvelles générations militantes, elles sont comme des feux qui naissent et qui s'éteignent. Voilà. Et la dernière chose que je voulais dire, désolé c'était un peu long, c'est que je pense que, en fait, à l'heure actuelle, on assiste à un effondrement, comme j'ai déjà dit, global du mouvement ouvrier avec des très fortes recompositions, et que là, on est dans des états où il y a des braises et on souffle dessus pour essayer de les maintenir. Et je pense que le mouvement féministe, et je pense que je ne suis pas la seule ici, a vraiment la possibilité à l'échelle internationale de relancer ce feu-là. Et de ce point de vue-là, on a une responsabilité qui est au-delà de nous-mêmes. On a une responsabilité pour l'ensemble de l'émancipation du genre humain, quoi, pour le dire un peu ambitieusement.
I'm not sure there was much question other than to say, I totally and completely agree. Thank you very much for having, and thank you very much for the interpreters. Yeah.
So, yeah, I think I could say the same. I mean, I think there's also a struggle. So a lot of, when I've been listening to today and I've been hearing about the sort of strike, you know, the international strike movement here, and I've been thinking about how could this connect to the movements back home, right? Where would be the connections and the common points? And I think that they, of course, we will find those connections, but I think we also need to understand that the language and the language, and I don't mean like in the words, but like the language and the form of the movement is different, and it looks different, and it sounds different, and there's a need to sort of really to foreground certain things and so on because of the particular historical moment that South Africa is in now. So, you know, I don't know. I think what that requires of us then is a kind of flexibility and a kind of openness, but also, yeah, like I mean, I'm also interested in that idea of like the commons. So, like, how would we extend the commons beyond just this particular physical place? Like, how would we do that, and so on? I think it's kind of too soon for me to be able to see all those connection points, and so on, because I also know that if comrades from home were here, would they find everything? Like, of course, there would be some meeting points, right? But like, we would have to work hard to find. I think that's the thing. It cannot be assumed. And we also need to think about doing more than just saying, well, you know, we'll invite you into this space, because I think much more needs to be done to really build a space that is actually open. Yeah, so.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that was said. Maybe just very briefly, because someone asked, how can we work together, especially now because of the rise of the alt-right and the far-right. Well, this is really, obviously, the big challenge now. But at the same time, I mean, paradoxically, or not paradoxically, I mean, in a way, I think that in some countries, and I'm thinking here of the United States, for example, I think that it's been also the rise of the far-right that, in a way, contributed to wake up, to bring, you know, masses of women on the street. So obviously the far right is showing in all these countries that its attack is truly intersectional, in the sense that they're really attacking women, working class women, migrant women through deportations, women from all classes and nationalities and so forth, through the attacks on reproductive rights. So in many ways, obviously, I mean, the right needs to be thought. I mean, it requires, by definition, an intersectional and a strong feminist movement, because its attack against women's rights is really rounded up, and it's really, I mean, it attacks women really through and through and across the border. So in that sense, in a way, we learn how to do it by doing it. And I think this is really what's going on in the United States, where now the feminist movement in the last 3 years obviously has faced its challenges and its issues, but it's really learning by doing it. And I think the same can be said about Italy, where now we had a huge response, for example, recently to the World Congress of Families. The family, sorry, very important correction, sorry. The family, you might have heard about this monster, that really monstrous thing that took place in Verona only a week ago or so. And the response was precisely a huge mobilization by the feminist women all across Italy. They went to Verona to demonstrate against these monsters. So, and I think in Italy, this is also what's happening. Women are, and the feminists are learning how to do this by doing it. And this is really what I think we can say. I also want to say very, very briefly, I completely agree with what the comrade said before. I think it was a really fantastic point, that we really are inheriting in a way. I mean, not inheriting. I think part of the reasons for all these fragmentations is also due, obviously, to the recomposition, the destruction and recomposition of the workers' movement. And in a way, we have to recompose all those pieces that have been, in the last 30 years, in some ways destroyed or fragmented and displaced and so forth. So in a way, more unity and is really the response here in that sense.
Thank you. Yes, I also agree with, and especially the comments that are making us reflect. So I want to say something very briefly about what Penny raised about the miners' strike. The way I understand the coming of neoliberalism is neoliberalism launched a dual attack. The first attack was to reorganize production. And you can see the spectacular strikes that neoliberalism needed to break in order to restructure production. One was the miners in Britain, the textile workers in India, in Mumbai, and the PATCO, the air traffic controllers in the US. And, you know, we can add Australia to that as well. But these were spectacular moments of neoliberal victory that it needed to announce that we have defeated the working class. So that was organizing production at the point of production for neoliberalism. That needed to happen. The second assault was the need to reorganize reproduction. So from the state taming markets, we moved to the markets taming states. So all public provisioning was denuded, cut, attacked. They were not completely taken away, only reserved for the few. So the parks still existed, but only for their children to play in. The hospitals still existed, but only for their bodies to be repaired, not ours. So either social services were cut and completely taken away, or they were privatized beyond the means of working class families. Whatever the form, the state retreated, and very willingly retreated, because these local ruling classes played a willing role in their retreat from it. The retreat of the state came hand in hand. The retreat of the state from social provisioning necessarily came hand in hand with an escalation of the carceral duties of the state. Think about it. If the hospitals and schools in your area closed down, then the communities in those areas are going to protest. That's why you need more police in those neighborhoods to make sure that the communities did not protest. You needed more police to contain discontent. So the carceral, you needed to raise borders against migrant communities who were being driven out because of the denudation of social provisioning and from the actions of international bodies like the WTO that basically cut food subsidies in countries of the global south. And when migrants came from these communities to our borders, the state willingly militarized the waters and militarized the borders of these states. So this is a double movement of neoliberalism that came for the last 40 years. The common understanding was that taking away the tools that working class people traditionally used to fight capitalism, unions, political parties, by attacking those and limiting their power, this was a victory against the working class. But the working class does not just work. The working class sleeps, the working class plays in parks. So when the tools of protest were taken away by the break and decline of union, working class communities started protesting in other ways. This is why throughout the period of neoliberalism, you see a rise in defense of social reproduction and social provisioning. And these movements then come to the fore and acquire a different anti-capitalist political charge. In this, I think I want to really talk about what the comrade said here about historical memory, because there is an absolute need to rebuild historical memory of the unity of these struggles as existed in previous periods of anti-capitalist movements. So I want to give a bad example to highlight why we need this. When there was an effort to unionize Volkswagen workers in the US South, the US South is known for its union busting history. So UAW, the Union of Auto Workers, went to organize this Volkswagen plant in Chattanooga in the South. One of the things that the bosses made an agreement with the union bureaucrats, the leaders, that they could do propaganda for unionization in the workplace, but they must promise not to visit the workers in their homes. So organizing must be limited to the workplace. The union leaders were not allowed to go into the homes of the workers. Meanwhile, the bosses had access to local media and the television, so there were strong anti-union adverts being bombarded every day at a generalized level. But the union bureaucrats said, fine, we will not go to their homes because home is not where political organizing takes place. But these are communities in Chattanooga and the West, in the South, where that political memory of labor action has been lost. Union halls where workers went into to sing union songs, to have union Labor Day picnics had been lost. So the idea of separating out community organizing from labor organizing was actually hurtful to labor organizing, not just to community organizing. So did the UAW campaign win? Hell no. So they didn't win because they limited their power of organizing merely to the workplace, as it were. So I think our job here is to do two things. One is to have these sort of meetings and writings and constant incitement of that historical memory, of trying to rebuild those tracks which connect our present to the past of previous activists and revolutionary socialists. The second, I think, is to politicize solidarity. That the reason I stand with you is not because I think it's a good thing to stand for Palestine. It is because your interest is linked to mine. Your freedom is linked to my freedom. And this vital understanding of politicized solidarity we need to reinvest in, to talk about, advocate, and fight for, not just in our workplaces, in our homes, in our communities, but most of all on our streets. Thank you.